Right, okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome to the second of this semester's Welsh Aesthetics Forum talks. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Nick Zangwill from UCL and Lincoln, who's going to talk about formalism and the aesthetics of nature. Don't really think Nick needs much by way of introduction, and if I did give an exhaustive introduction, it would probably take longer than the talk. But he's published over 150 articles, he's written multiple books. His research interests and outputs, I think, span most areas of philosophy, I think. Metaphysics, aesthetics, ethics, all sorts of stuff. And has been lots of places. Recently, apparently also Japan, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and so on. And he's also well known for skeptical views and views that don't necessarily go along with the flow, which is exciting because that's becoming rarer and rarer these days. But yeah, so thanks to the British Society of Aesthetics for funding us, and please join me in welcoming Nick. Yeah, do you want me to say something?
Thank you really much. Thank you so much. Great to be here. And I'm sorry about the E. I was doing this last night and at 12:30, and this random E came along. I don't know what that means, but yeah. And it's funny. I did my doctorate wasn't on aesthetics, although that's most of what I've done. I suppose the majority of what I've published, I suppose, is on aesthetics. But I worked on metaethics and mind. And then I started, after I finished my doctorate, I started doing aesthetics. And I think sometimes, I should start my talk, I'm getting sidetracked already. But sometimes I think not doing a doctorate on something helps. Because if you do a doctorate on something, you're told, you learn what the right issues are. And those are the things we discuss, and we know you do in political philosophy, you do rules, and you do blah, blah, blah. And because I didn't do aesthetics, and then I started really, but also I sort of but I was interested in the arts and beauty of nature and things like that at the same time. And then when I came to look at it, my thought was, it's all crazy, it's all wrong. And they were all doing this anti-formalist thing when I came into it in the 90s. And I thought, I'm not going to go along with that. I'm going to kick in the other direction, which was fun. And I don't know, that's how I came to it. But I think not doing this as a doctorate somehow was formative, because I think I wouldn't have had the strength to maybe say, oh, well, I know I'm supposed to read Walton and Danto and Goodman and my friend Jerry Levinson and all these people, but even so, I'm going to anyway, let me get on with it before I get sidetracked. So here's what we're going to do, talk about the aesthetics of nature, where I'm going to pursue a formalist view, look at the general issue, set up the general issue of formalism, and then look at the aesthetics of nature, and then get into a particular issue in part 3, which is more distinctively me, and the rest is sort of laying things out, I suppose, laying out the issue. So the issue tends to be about whether the aesthetic features of things, including beauty, which you might use as a kind of marker to fix the aesthetic. That's the way I do it. And it's the issue, a sort of negative feature is, how much does it depend on the history of production? And that's what anti-formalists such as Walton, Levinson, and if you go outside of analytic philosophy, there's all sorts of people around in the arts, Gombrich, and literary theory, just about wherever you go, there are people pursuing this. So there's an issue about what the aesthetic properties depend on, and also an issue about what we need in order to make an aesthetic judgment. How much history do you need to know? But that can't be satisfactory because it's a negative view. You also need a positive view if you're a formalist to say what is aesthetically relevant. But let's focus to some extent on the history. So here's Gombrich. This is just laying out the issue. So here's a well-known anti-formalist, and this book, I think, when I started talking about this, it had sold 10 million. It's probably up to 20 million by now, or more, and plus translations. Just check out the title. I mean, That's all you need to do here. Just to understand the work of art, you've got to see it as in its role, its place in a story, look at its wider context. So the title is no accident there. And it's a Hegelian idea that really you must understand us and our cultural products in historical terms. But it's not compulsory. You could go with this guy who famously said, history is bunk. So there is a question how far, it's not just about our cultural products, about us. How far are we historically constituted? Huge political issue. How far are we creatures of where we came from, or are we, do we have a nature, maybe more an existentialist idea, so we can make ourselves in a way which is independent of where we come from? Because students at universities are famous for remaking themselves at university, but then 10 years later they think, I'm just like my mum and dad, how did that happen? That wasn't supposed to happen. But there's a sort of a year or a few years where you think, no, I'm forging a new me, nothing to do with where I come from and my culture or history and parents and background and all that. Now, it would be, so if you're going to be a formalist, you've got to be a bit, sensible. I like to be sensible. And so of course there's representations. Of course there's representations in visual art, for example. And if you're to understand the beauty or aesthetic characteristics of a representation of something, then you've got to know what it's of. And to know what it's of, you've got to know what it's representing. And arguably, plausibly, the thing gets to represent what it is because the person who made it gave it the function of representing it. So it's something that lands from outer space, just like from a cosmic coincidence, from lightning striking, doesn't represent anything. It's got to have a certain history to represent. So if beauty depends on that representation, that beauty also depends on its history. And that's a way of saying that, in many cases, the thing is beautiful as a thing with this representational function. It would go for many other functions, not all, but many other functions of artworks are historical, and therefore the beauty that depends on those functions is also historical. Now this debate about this comes out in one thing I like about aesthetics is it's really Quinean, if you see what I mean. In that you've got the abstract philosophy, but it really does connect with what people argue about and what matters to practicing, for example, architects. If you're an architect, it matters whether you're a formalist or not. If you're a formalist, you'll design buildings differently from if you're an anti-formalist. They wouldn't use those terms they talk about. We'll maybe mention that later, but it connects with practice and connects with art history. So here's an early Pollock. So if you're to understand that, according to, I'm riffing on Tom Wolfe here, for those who know Tom Wolfe's, the painted word. According to this critic, you've got to know how it got there. So there was a famous Time magazine cover, Jack the Dripper, it was called. So you've got to know the history, how it got to be like that, but not if you're with Red Mounted. And I love this guy, Clement Greenberg, completely uneducated New Yorker, just with lots of attitude, but actually cleverer than all the academics in America, in Berkeley, and that cleverer than T.J. Clark, for example, the art historian, when they clash. You see, Greenberg has got the better of that one. So, wonderful guy, I think, but really unfairly portrayed in the Pollock film. So the question, though, is we really need a better, much sharper characterization of what a formalist view would be. So we know that it's not a matter of history, but what is it a matter of? So we need something positive as well as negative. And I think I used to say that it was a matter of the sensory properties, but I think now I want to say it's a matter of appearances playing a crucial role. Or rather appearances, and this will get me into trouble with people who know philosophy of mind. I shouldn't flag where I should get into trouble. This idea of a mere appearance where it's not penetrated by our knowledge of how things are. there's an issue about appearances and reality and the question of whether they should appear as they are. And if you know, a lot of modernist architects hate postmodernism in architecture because no, things should appear as they are. They shouldn't be fake. A fake facade, for example, the sort of thing you have in Las Vegas, it's like the most horrible thing you could have for a modernist. That's why that book, Learning from Las Vegas, is so controversial. The author's name. Okay, so think about what's an appearance property, though, which is the way I now like to go about it. So what's an appearance property? And of course, this is a subtle matter. So it can be it's culturally affected. So those of you who spent the time or are from East Asia will know that when most people look at the moon, they don't see a man in the moon. When I was brought up, it was the man in the moon, but there they see a rabbit pounding rice. And this is a 18th century Korean button. But it's just quite normal. And when I first started going to East Asia, I found that really surprising, but that's quite normal. So what you see, the appearances of things that you see are affected by our knowledge, but the important point is that it's these appearances which are of central aesthetic importance. So this is a famous example you'll all know. But so the idea of a bare appearance is one which, even though we know they're the same length, it carries on looking the same. And those are the kind of appearances which are aesthetically important. That's another famous example. The two squares are the same colour. But if you can imagine, some French impressionist or Cézanne, I can imagine, they're using colours in this way in their picture, and they might use the same physical colour, but it would be the appearance that matters in the aesthetic properties or features that the painting throws up. It's how they appear in that sense, the sense in which those two colours are different. And also it can, it's a matter of the shapes. There's the appearance of shapes, not just the appearance of colours. Okay. So, appearances are a funny kind of property. You can say, so it seems like if you're describing things, you might describe the features they have, and their appearances would be one of the properties that they would have. And here you have, I mentioned architecture, but this also illustrates how poignant it all is, because it connects with these really substantial issues about architectural theory and practice. My friend Branko, I think there's a picture of him in a minute. So, they sent me to see Palladio. You've got to go and see Palladio. And Palladio is a kind of Platonist. So if you're a Platonist in architecture, you think that the plan is what really matters. Think about the plan of a church or of a modernist building. Whereas if you're an Aristotelian in architecture, this is talking Renaissance jargon, then it's the way they appear. Think of Aristotle as a kind of proto-empiricist. It's about appearances that we encounter in perception. So you have an issue there, and there's a kind of formalism in the Renaissance times. I'm getting all this from my friend Branko, this guy. That sounds very scholarly, but it's really just ripped off him. But he also writes things, and he rips things off me, so that's okay. Sounds very philosophical. Anyway, so there's an issue about. So he thinks that architecture should be a visual art, which anyone who knows anything about architecture these days couldn't be more controversial. For ordinary people, it's incredibly normal and prosaic view, but in architecture schools, you'd probably be thrown out for even whispering that. So here's the famous Yellow Temple of Kyoto, I pronounce it better. And there's something here I want you to draw your attention to. It's really, 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 really obvious when you're thinking about this question appearances should be true to reality is the reflection. And so this is one of the ways I'm going to be going here. One of the things I'm going to go on a lot is about reflections and their importance in beauty, and certainly their importance in architecture. And there's a case there where the reflection is crucial. Here's a really ugly building. I think it's extremely ugly. Has anyone been to Kyoto? Because this is the Kyoto railway station, and it's not impressive. And it's, one of the most beautiful cities in the world. How could they do this? But nonetheless, if I can get this right, that's right. That's a reflection over there. So there's a kind of harmony there between these two sides, but one is not real. This thing is just a reflection. That thing there. So there's kind of what matters here. In this, if you were describing that, you would describe it in terms of appearance, and there's an appearance of the two sides echoing each other, but one is a kind of metal structure and the other is a reflection. You get this all over the place. So this is my conclusion here. Of course, I've been walking down your corridors, and we're supposed to sort of valorize women philosophers these days, but this time, not all the time. So this one, I think, has been not this one. So this is very much placed at this influence. This is Diotima from the Symposium, and Diotima's view was that reality matters, and that the beauty, there's a kind of higher beauty. The whole point about the Symposium is that there's a beauty that takes you beyond our appearances, and there's a beauty which connects you with reality as it really is, and that's where true beauty resides. And there's nothing more beautiful, actually, than the beautiful itself, if you remember, for those of you who have done Plato. So it's this tendency celebrated in the Symposium and attributed to Diotima, who, there's a book recently saying that she was the, there's a book by Armand Dangour, a popular book, saying that she was actually an early lover of Pericles. And she's a real person, she wasn't just a person in myth. I'm actually a bit sceptical about that historical theory, but it's controversial. But that is this tendency of thought to say that appearances are superficial, and there is beauty in appearances, but are to be transcended in a higher beauty. But that would mean that the beauty of the shadows and the reflections, I'm going to come to shadows in a minute, should be downgraded at least, or ignored. So the question is, a formalist is someone who puts appearances, and it doesn't matter whether they're veridical or not, in the centre. Now let's turn to the aesthetics of nature, with that under our belt. So this is it's quite extraordinary, this paper. He wrote a paper, 1965, he was at Edinburgh for his career. Wrote a lot about theology, and I don't really get on with that side of his work. He just wrote this extraordinary one paper in which he launched the entire discipline of nature aesthetics in at least the English-speaking world. Quite amazing. That's Ronnie Hepburn. But it's been pursued. There's a huge bee there. Okay. Nature is intervening. I'm sorry. So it's been pursued quite a lot. This guy Carlson recently died, actually, and he sort of took up the challenge from Hepburn, and almost everyone in both of them were anti-formalists. Let's say some things about the aesthetics of nature. And one thing is this idea of that nature doesn't come with a frame. So one thing with a work of art is it makes a huge difference. You've got, there's it starts and then it stops, and it's what happens within the frame, and that's relevant and that echoes that, and there's a sort of limit to it. Same with a musical performance. You've got the tapping of the conductor's baton or whatever, or take it away 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it is, and then the applause at the end. And the applause isn't part of it, and the tapping of the baton isn't part of it. But nature's not like this. It doesn't come chopped up in a neat way. But that's because artworks are artifacts. They're made, and they're made to have beginnings and ends, or rather, of course, there are conceptual works that deliberately try to mess with that. But there's a kind of indeterminacy or an arbitrariness over the units of appreciation. And of course, that means that if you've got a chunk of nature, say you've got a field, you could do it very close up, you could do that bit of the field to over there, you could do this bit over there to those trees, include those animals. So as you select a different chunk, the aesthetic properties are going to vary. So it looks as if that might be an argument for thinking, well, there's no such thing as the qualities, the aesthetic properties of the areas of nature, whichever you are, because the properties they have will depend how you cut them up. And the second aspect is this idea that nature, unlike art, is immersive. And okay, it's also true of architecture, of course. You have to immerse yourself into it. It's not so. There's supposed to be a contrast with the purely contemplative. But I like this example of an ant crawling up your leg. You're lying down, looking at the sky, appreciating the trees, and then there's this sort of annoying, itchy, particularly ant. And so, but some people will say, no, that's just part of what the experience of nature is or should be, immersive in that way. I would like to think there's a way around these issues. I would like to say just suggestions that just grant all the properties there are, but maybe there are more properties than we think. Do we have a sort of cap on the number of aesthetic properties that something has? It could be that there's an incredible complexity in a field, for example, depending on how you shift the frame around, how far you focus in or focus out, and you get different aesthetic properties. But why can't they all be properties of the things in question? Because of course it is still combinations that generate properties. A, B and C can generate a property that A, B and D don't, and E, F and G. So they can be all those properties, depending on how you combine the elements. Whereas if you've got an artwork, the nature of that artifact is saying that this is the unit, this is where it starts, this is where it stops, in most cases. So there's just a lot more properties out there. And perhaps, I'm not so sure what to say about it. And certainly there is an immersive, you walk through the woods. My brother was a mountaineer. I'm sure he had fantastic experiences. I've seen his photographs right up in the mountains with these glaciers and all this amazing stuff. And you need to be sort of in it, experiencing it. But I'm not sure about the more physical, cold aspects of it, and the tickle of the ant. Maybe, you see, this is one thing we're going to come to later. There's aesthetic experiences and there's experiences. This relates to the Bach stuff as well. Sorry, yes. Yes. Maybe you can include some experiences, but not others. Now, there's a big movement in nature aesthetics going from Carlson and Hepburn to say that science, that you need science to really understand the beauties of nature. That if you're a Philistine of any kind, so Philistines don't get to understand much about art, and they don't get to understand much about nature. That's the view. And the point is, the idea is that that when you really understand how a cloud works, for example, or if you really understand the chemistry of what's really going on, in a flower or in an animal or a cloud or a rock, if you understand how those markings on the rock are made through the volcanic activity, that's how it's got there, then that puts you in a position to appreciate more the person who just says, duh, who doesn't know anything about it. So if the scientific knowledge can enhance your aesthetic appreciation. And that's really the standard view, but I think it's stronger than that. It's that the view is that without that, you're going to be mistaken, and your appreciation will be actually defective in some ways. I think they take it, well, different people who hold this view hold it in different strengths. So to some extent there's something in it, when you're looking at the beauty of something, you need to know, you often need to know the functions in question. And so this is very much like the issue of representation in painting. You need to know that that's a representation of a tree, or a woman, or a sheep, or whatever it is, in order to appreciate the representational painting. And similarly, you need to know what a wing is and what it's for. And so I just want to grant that. Nevertheless, it's also true that those very same things can have properties which you don't need to know what they're for. So I think this is a kind of what I call a moderate formalism view. So you say you grant that they're true to an extent, that you need to know what the functions are, but still there's a beauty. There can be a beauty in things with functions which isn't dependent on the functions. I think I said that right. As well. So there are both kinds of beauties. There are two kinds of beauties, the formal beauties and the non-formal beauties. And things can have both. So you don't want to be bullied by the anti-formalists into denying, as they sometimes hold a very strong view, that all beauty has to be appreciated by a knower who knows what these things are, in a sense, that what these appearances are true to. I've just said that. So that's the moderate view. So there's, where there are functions, they need to be understood in nature, right? And a lot of nature is living nature or ex-living, under which I'd include things like, animals' skulls, the things that Georgia O'Keeffe used to paint, so that you can have beautiful bones. I actually own a horse's skull. I brought it through customs from Arizona. I used to work in Arizona. They scanned it and were very shocked when I put it through to go in the plane. I don't know why. Anyway, but there's some beautiful things, but I would include those as organic nature in a way. But then the question is, a lot of nature doesn't have functions. Okay, you could be religious. You could think everything's designed, but presumably, let's assume there are some things which don't have at least those kind of organic functions that an eye has or a wing has to enable you to fly or something like that. So then the question is, does it make a difference if something is an artifact or not? This dates me, this picture. Douglas Adams. There was a time when everyone knew Douglas Adams.
42.
You get older, that happens. But anyway, so the question, the joke is that someone got an award. Someone made the Earth, some extra, some terrestrials or whatever, and someone got an award for the fields because they were so impressive. And it's like, so it turns out that the fields are actually an artifact. Well, suppose you find the fields are actually an artifact. Does that change your assessment of them? And then you enter this sort of game. There's this game in aesthetics. There's a game in philosophy. Analytic philosophers like to play, and I think continental philosophers find it really dull in my experience. But the game is the doppelganger case. So you've got a case of two things which are exactly the same in intrinsic respects, but differ relationally, and one is thinking about water and the other isn't. You've probably come across that. We love that game because, in a sense, you can see it. You can see why it might seem to be fun. But the trouble with that game is the different people have different intuitions about what you're supposed to say about the examples. Quite often, so they don't always. So if you're not sure what to think, sometimes one of those examples could shift you. But anyway, but it definitely in the aesthetics of nature, people don't agree on. So I can't remember which it is now. One of these is an artificial lake and one's a real lake. But does it make a difference to their beauty or their other also other aesthetic properties that you might want to?
Or whether they're nature.
Well, yeah, it might make a difference to whether they're nature or not, but the question is whether it makes a difference to the aesthetic properties of whatever it is that thing is. One's an artifact and one isn't, or partly an artifact in a way that the other isn't. And the question is, does it make a difference? And I say yes, but then I come across people who say no. Now, the formalist is someone who says that it's appearances that matter. Remember that? So it's the way things appear. But which appearances? And now this is where I get into trouble. Because the scientific anti-formalists can draw on their philosophy of perception, and the way perception generally is affected by what we know. So you've probably done this in the philosophy of perception, that if you look at something without certain knowledge, without the certain knowledge which it won't have, something can't appear to you to be a coin, for example, unless you know what coins are. So there's a certain kinds of appearances which are infected by our knowledge. But the question is, how important is that in the aesthetics of nature? And I want to be sceptical at this point, and I want to suggest, or try and persuade you with an example, which of course, given what I've just said, may not work, but let's see if it can attract maybe some of you to agreeing with me. So here's an example. Actually, when I first gave this paper, I was invited to a conference and didn't have really time to prepare for it properly, so I was on the way and I took this picture out of the window. So I'm a great fan of the beauty of clouds. I love to sit nearby the window seat in an aeroplane. I can stare for hours at clouds. And clouds have a certain appearance properties, and they have aesthetic properties, including beauty, which depends on how they appear. And this was an EasyJet flight, I believe. But now look at this. So here's how people think of clouds, but it's absolutely clear that cherubs, clouds appear, clouds are a Muller-Lyer illusion. Clouds appear to be solid, but they're not. If you tried sitting on that, you'd plummet to earth extremely quickly. Whereas the whole point about all the paintings, which like this, is they appear to be like cotton wool and comfy, and that's how they appear. But that's part of the aesthetic appeal of clouds, is that how they have that kind of semi-solid appearance, comfy. It seems comfy, doesn't it? Of course, when you get, it's weird when you walk in the hills and you find yourself in a cloud. You think that's not to be in a cloud. Isn't how clouds look like from a distance. It's completely different. So the question is, what matters here? And I suggest that what matters aesthetically is that misleading appearance. Are we on half past?
Yeah.
Great, that's good. Now, so I think that's a problem for the scientific anti-formalists. So you could say, suppose, and then there's a strategic issue, and this is the stuff panelists I was saying that I'm not quite sure where to go on this exactly. That you can strategically, you could say, well, okay, you scientific formalists, I'll give you that you can see all these extra wonderful stuff given your fantastic knowledge, and you can see these extra beauties. But, you know, what about all the kind of nonsense and superstitions that you might have, which might cause you to see other things that are just not there? So, you know, so Dawkins is an example, actually. I was surprised to find this. You know, he says, no, you can't be ignorant of science. And he criticizes poets who do bad science in their poetry. But there's a kind of imagination here of a poet that can supply things which aren't necessarily in reality, which can supply new appearances. The tree is full of pixies. And they can be aesthetically important, and it's mere imagination. It's stuff that isn't actually there. So it's not as, so you could say there's a question of it supplying this extra insight, and you know, perhaps, I don't know, there is these extra beauties, but it also, the scientific knowledge can sometimes not be relevant at all. So in the case of murmuration, when birds collect before they emigrate, incredibly beautiful. I haven't got a clue what's going on, and then I found out more. Go on Wikipedia, find out what's going on. It's absolutely incredible, absolutely astonishing. I think it involves quantum mechanics as far as I gather. Birds' navigation involves quantum mechanical principles. If quantum mechanics wasn't true, they couldn't migrate, apparently. It's extraordinary what goes on. But that's terribly interesting scientifically. I don't think it enhances your sense of the beauty of what's going on in murmuration. So it's this restrictiveness of my opponent that I am really against. Okay, they're adding stuff, so I could go in there and say, look, you're not adding stuff. With the murmuration example, I could say, look, you don't add anything. Oops, sorry, you don't add anything to the appreciation of that. But also it's what they're subtracting when they say you shouldn't appreciate things in terms of illusory experiences, because I think our whole experiences of clouds, for example, and many other things of that kind, is going to disappear. Imagination is all over the place. This is from the aquarium in Kyoto. There are also, I mean, it looks like a face, isn't it? But it isn't. So should we somehow, I mean, maybe just disregard that? There's no way to get away from that appearance. It forces itself on you. So it's this the disregard for the illusory appearances, or for the factors which aren't actually in, or the appearances which aren't true to a reality. So I'm not sure. So here is. This actually isn't nature. This is the Moss Temple from Kyoto, which is one of the few temples you actually have to pay anything. I think I had to pay like £6 to get into it. It was Steve Jobs' favourite temple. Anyway, you know, and if you, this is, but just excuse me for a moment. That is a garden actually. It's got 120 different kinds of moss in it. Absolutely incredible. But look, what do we see here? We see shadows and we see reflections. So this I take to be a paradigm of our experience of the beauty of nature. So, and I think the scientific view, there's no place for the role and the centrality of that in the anti-formalist view. So so to some extent the argument is conservatism here. I'm appealing to folk aesthetics, roughly our common sense or everyday view, and I'm saying, look, you are revising that. So I suppose that's the kind of dialectical that you find quite a lot in philosophy. You have our sort of conceptual scheme or our views which could be wrong. There's nothing sacrosanct about our folk theories, but they might, could turn out that they're culturally local, but they could turn out to be have an innate basis as well. But if you're really gonna convict major parts of our folks' aesthetics as being wrong, you've got to have an incredible argument for that. And of course Plato does. You know, he has this incredible view of the world. He has this extraordinary metaphysics, which is incredible. It's incredible. I mean, I love Plato, who's my favourite philosopher, but I don't, you know, there are limits. So the arguments would have to be amazing and amazingly strong. And I don't think they are. You know, you'd have to think about, and it's too wildly revisionary. Has anyone seen Durham Cathedral? I used to work in Durham. So I used to work in Durham. So Durham Cathedral is like some of these Kyoto temples as well. It's good. If you're there in different times of the year, it's a different thing, and you appreciate the thing as it changes through the seasons. I used to know people at York University, and I used to say, we've got the best cathedral in you. No. Pevsner says it's the second most beautiful cathedral in Europe, if you trust Pevsner on architecture. Anyway, but it's the appearances as it you know, at different times, which are, and so I see these scientific anti-formalists, Dawkins, as the Puritan. You know, once again, he's a Puritan. He's such a Puritan generally, but you see this kind of Puritan way of thinking coming out, just sort of banning things which aren't scientifically validated, because there are illusory appearances or mere appearances. So again, that's the conclusion. It's just. Well, I mean, I suppose my conclusion is that slightly. I'll change it slightly. It's not that just say no to that, but you know, if you're going to say yes to, you know, you better have a hugely revised view of the world, and a quite incredible general theory, and of course, it's a theory which, in the end, Plato. Well, in a sense, there is a role for appearances, but they're just a stepping stone. And this is the Diotima view. They're a stepping stone on the way to a higher reality. I don't mind higher realities. I'm okay with higher realities. You know, you want God or whatever, that's fine with me. But not higher beauties. So I think that the beauties are restricted to, they're a sort of this worldly phenomenon manifest in the appearances that we can appreciate, and sometimes with the aid of imagination, which can take us right away from from how things actually are. So the appearances that we have do not have to be kosher appearances, which are veridical and actually represent how the world is. And I take it that a shadow or a reflection doesn't, you know, when you look in the mirror, there's no one there in the mirror. I was reminded of that. I was in, like I'm name dropping fancy places. Well, okay, I was in somewhere in the world. There's a photographer called Boris Leiter. He sort of documented New York life. And I saw a documentary made when he was about 90. He died about a year later. He said he walks around New York and he sees and he was an old guy, and I'm beginning to understand this now. He says, he looks in the mirror and he thinks, who's this old guy who keeps following me about? Because you're looking in the you're looking in the windows of shops. So it's, these appearances dog you. So, you know, but do these, you know, is it, which kind of appearances matter? And that's the question. Do they have to? So there's limits on it, and they don't have to be. So they don't have to be the appearances which are stamped off as veridical. So a reflection of you. There's no person there. It's a mistake if you think there's someone there in the mirror, and that's why sort of children's stories are fun when you can step through into the mirror. That's the imagination speaking. But think about that Kyoto picture with the mirror reflection. That's a rich part of our aesthetic lives. And there's a playful aspect of that. There's an imaginative aspect of that which the anti-formalists and Puritans like Dawkins cannot cope with. And that's a mistake.
So as usual, we'll take a few minutes to compose ourselves and we'll